Welcome to the AxeCast podcast. Conversations with interesting people from the world of Acadia athletics and more, talking about their lives, successes, and failures. And now let's join hosts Len Hawley and Eric Cedarberg for the next 15 to 20 minutes as they dive into the life of today's guest.
This week on our AxeCast, we meet an Acadia alum from the class of 1969 who has written many books, mostly baseball, but is a sports enthusiast and, dare I say it, a Boston Red Sox diehard enthusiast. Jim Prime is with us this week. Hey, Jim, great to have you.
It's great to be here, Len and Eric. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Jim, well, let's provide a little bit of context because you're from Digby County. In fact, you have to go down to the islands, Freeport.
Yes, I love Freeport. I don't get back there as often as I like, but I grew up there, and there's something about growing up on an island it's a very tight-knit community, and I still have lots of friends down there, and I just love the place. There's something in the salt air down there that's unlike any other place in the world.
You had to have grown up a sports enthusiast. Where did you get your sports fix living on the islands in Digby County?
You think? I guess for Major League sports, it was the fact that we're stuck out in the Bay of Fundy, and so we could pick up broadcasts of the Boston Red Sox, the Boston Bruins. It was an ideal place in that regard. You could literally pick up the Grand Ole Opry live. The airwaves were just alive with radio stations. So I grew up listening to New York stations, Boston stations, and all the affiliates up the Maine coast.
So go ahead,
Sorry to interrupt, but we played a lot of baseball down there. I played for a team, a ragtag team, I'll say, called the Freeport Schooners. We organized it, and we played on a field that was similar to the surface of the moon in terms of its manicured diamond. It wasn't the best, but we had a lot of fun. And I wrote to the Boston Red Sox because I'd read about this guy who coached the Kentville Wildcats named Eddie Gillis, who had gotten baseballs from the Boston Red Sox one time, batting practice balls. It may have been from the St. Louis Cardinals. I know he was a St. Louis fan. But anyway, that planted an idea with me. So I wrote to Tom Yawkey, who was then the owner of the Red Sox, and, not expecting anything. But within a few weeks, the customs office called and said that there was a package there for me, and there were 12 pristine baseballs there. Some had green marks from Fenway Park grass on them, which made them even better. And so that kind of sealed my love of the Red Sox, and I was a Red Sox fan ever since then.
Well, we're going to find out as we go through this interview, you are one of the most persistent people on the planet. And so obviously it started at a very young age.
It did. Actually, that's one of my proudest things, Len. It's funny you should say that. You asked for 3 words that describe me in your pre-interview. And the one that I'm proudest of, Ted Williams said that I was the most persistent son of a bitch he ever met in his life. So,
Tell us
proudly.
Tell us how the road to Acadia was established for you.
Well, my father had gone to Horton Academy. My mother was a nurse. There was never any question that I was going to Acadia. Dad just loved the Annapolis Valley, even though he lived down on the islands, and he fished and all those things. Worked in fish factories. Worked in the bank in Boston for a while. But there's always assumed that myself and my sister would go to university, and there was no other university in the world except Acadia University. I mean, that was a slam dunk. I think they honestly believed that Acadia was, Harvard and Cambridge all wrapped up into one. It's just a wonderful university, beautiful campus and all that. So I went away to university, graduated, as you said, in '69. Those were the heydays of basketball at Acadia. Hockey wasn't quite so prominent. Football, we watched with great enthusiasm, but they weren't great teams either. But the basketball, those were the days of Brian Heaney. Actually, the first year I went, Heaney was sitting out because they were just finishing the new gym. So they were playing their games over at the Wolfville High School. And I don't think they played in the old basketball court. I think it was all at Wolfville High School. And I went to games there, not knowing much about Brian Heaney. And I remember going down to the old gym, which had the balconies around and so on. And Heaney was playing an intramural for an intramural team, if you can imagine, Willett. And
Nice.
in my extreme wisdom, I said to my friend, hey, this guy's pretty good. He could probably play varsity. And he was he had already played his 3 years, so he wanted to play his 4th year in the new gym, which he ended up doing.
So you were there at very exciting times, as you mentioned, in basketball. Like, what role would you have played in athletics? Like, you were part of the Athenaeum and what have you. Were you doing?
I did write for the Athenaeum. That was about it. I was a fan, super fan. That was about it. But I remember some of those games so vividly. I remember when Brian Heaney scored 74 points against Mount Allison. It was just unbelievable performance. And that was before the 3-point line. So God knows how many he would have had with the 3-point line. And they took him out with like 3 minutes left.
I had heard that.
So that was incredible. And football games, I remember just the fanaticism. I don't know if we have the fanaticism quite as we did then. The St. Mary's Acadia rivalry was paramount. I know it still exists.
Football, for sure.
They took it so seriously. We all took it so seriously.
Well, I think maybe part of the problem is this now.
Yeah.
I look at our student fans, and some of them are just kind of doing this as a game going on.
I know.
I want to tell you something. I'm going to be flat out honest here. Baseball, I've watched. My dad used to take me to some expo games, which was a very bad place to watch a baseball game in the Olympic Stadium. So I wasn't really attracted to it.
Right.
But I've always played baseball. Like I played every sport there is. I've tried it. I played baseball for 1 year, and I was picked up. I was a kid on the street that had a really good arm and throwing a football. So a coach on the street said, "I bet you can throw a baseball pretty good." And I did. My dad, who played some AA baseball, here I'm a son of a person who played AA baseball, and I didn't touch a sport. So, anyways, my youngest child started baseball 2 years ago and loves it, and now I'm starting to love it myself.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. It's an acquired taste.
It is an acquired taste. You're right. And I've really developed an appreciation over the last couple of years of the sport. And as I look at the long list of books you have, I'm going to have to try to get myself one of those books off online. I'll order online because of this whole COVID issue, but I'm definitely going to delve into one of your books.
I think there's something to be said for discovering a sport on the radio. Len, I'm sure you'll agree with this but there's something about the descriptions of, in my case, Fenway Park, that made it so. And in those days, the Red Sox had two of the best announcers around, Kurt Gowdy and Ned Martin, and they just painted these pictures of Fenway Park. I didn't have to see the place. I knew what it looked like. So when I first went in there many years later, it was just everything I thought it would be, the lush green of the grass and the green of the wall and all the curves. And it's a very eccentric ballpark, Fenway. So I discovered all that. But I knew about it because of the great descriptions of Kurt Gowdy, the same that you provide very well, Len, in your hockey broadcast, I have to say. So I think that when you discover it that way, it's like a little treasure you've discovered late at night. The Red Sox are playing on the West Coast, and you discover it on your radio, and they're playing the Angels, and you get trapped up in it. And then it becomes, you start watching the game of the week, which they used to have every Saturday, and it's infectious, It's a wonderful thing. So that's why my love of baseball. I watched hockey from the very beginning. I just love hockey too. I was a Montreal Canadiens fan. I grew up in the era of John Beliveau, and I even remember a little of Rocket Richard on the old black and white with very snowy screen, but more of an Henri Richard era guy. But I love the Montreal. I love the fact that they were the Flying Frenchmen, the speedsters. The Toronto was the clutch and grab Leafs in those days, and anything to slow the opposition down. They used to say that their gloves were hollowed out so they could grab a hold of a jersey and hold them back without being caught and stuff like that.
My dad is from that era. Loved the Montreal Canadiens. He grew up in Toronto, and he went to a lot of Maple Leaf games. And he, of course, would be the only kid there with a jersey on. He had a Maurice Richard jersey and be amongst all these Leafs fans. And I don't know how he did it. Even his brothers, he's got 4 brothers, and they were all Maple Leaf fans. And he was this.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That's a tough assignment.
Jim, I wonder, were you around Acadia, Kentville when Montreal would have training camps in
You know, I
Kentville?
missed that somehow. I know about it, and I've heard many stories about it, but for some reason I didn't attend those at all. You know, I got to interview Jean Beliveau. I know he was in the Valley a few times. I never actually met him face to face, but two of the highlights of my career in writing were talking to Jean Beliveau. He's just the classiest guy you'd ever want to meet. So.
I have a good friend who about 2 years ago dropped off an Yvan Cornwallier stick that was broken. I think the blade is broken on it. He threw it over the glass at the Kentville Arena. And of course, when you stand it up, it's only about 3 feet high. He wasn't the tallest guy.
No, he was not. He was not.
But it's, some great stories there. Listen, let's get back on track in terms of transition us from your time as a student and how you get into the whole publishing world.
Yeah, well, I worked after I left Acadia, I started working for an educational publishing house, Gage Publishing. They published textbooks for school. They were one of the larger ones at the time. They later affiliated with Nelson, became Nelson Canada as well. But as part of that, I met a lot of writers, a lot of editors, editorial people. I always liked writing from my Acadia days and even before that in high school. So I decided that I wanted to do two things. One was to write, write a book perhaps. The other was to meet Ted Williams. I should point out, I got sick around that time. I had cancer. I was diagnosed with cancer. So I was in the Victoria General Hospital. And that's when it all kind of came to a head that, if I get out of this, I'm going to darn well do what I've said I was going to do. And that was to write, and that was to meet Ted Williams. So when I did get out after a month in the hospital, I wrote a letter to Ted Williams. I knew he lived in the Florida Keys. That's all I knew. I didn't know. I didn't have an address or anything. I fired off a letter to, I think it's called Isla Mirada, and it was one of the Florida Keys. Just Ted Williams, Isla Mirada, Florida. And didn't really expect anything. But within a few weeks, I got a letter back. It was postmarked Blackville, New Brunswick. I ripped it open, not thinking it was very important. And it was a letter from Ted. And I had requested an interview. And I probably played on my illness a little bit. I don't know. I'm sure I wasn't above doing that. So I probably did do that. And he wrote a very nice letter back saying he'd be happy to talk to me by phone or otherwise. He said, I've still got it on my wall here. He said, I'm not as mean and ornery as you may think. So, because he had the reputation for not liking writers very much. But anyway, the time came, and I called him and said I was coming up. And he said, well, now where are you staying? And I said, I'll get a place in Miramichi City, what is now Miramichi City. It was in Newcastle. And he said, oh, don't worry about that. You can stay at my place. I've got a cabin here. He had a complex of about 3 camps there, a main lodge and a couple of camps. And so I said, oh, that's very kind. So I went up and screwed up my courage and went up there. And I don't know who your big sports heroes are, but for me, Ted was God. This was like meeting the Pope or something. Yeah. So I went in there very trepidatiously and knocked on the door, and his lady friend, Louise Kaufman, answered the door, and she couldn't have been any nicer. She's just a very lovely lady. She invited me in. Ted was out fishing. So she entertained me a little bit there, and then Ted finally came in with his guide, Roy Curtis, and he looked at me and said, he introduced me to Roy, and he said, this is Jim. He's a writer. And he said it with this contempt just dripping from his mouth, in a phony kind of way. And so anyway, we sat down after that. He poured me some rye in a Texaco glass, I'll never forget. And that relaxed me considerably. And we had a great talk. And I watched him tie flies as I interviewed him. And the first interview, I think, was in the Chronicle Herald, went in the Chronicle Herald, and subsequently in a baseball magazine in the U.S. And then every year I'd go back, and every year I'd start bugging Ted. I said, Ted, we got to write a book. He said, no, I don't want to write it. He's a very profane guy. So, I grew up in a fishing community, but he taught me a few words I hadn't heard before. And he said, I don't want to write. I've said everything I need to say in The Science of Hitting, which was the definitive how to hit a baseball book, and My Turn at Bat, which was his biography. And I said, the one thing you haven't done, Ted, is to rank the great hitters of all time. He said, no, I'm not interested in that. So I kept working at him. This is where the persistent part comes in. And I'd send him articles every once in a while because someone was always writing a book about 100 best players in baseball, 100 greatest hitters in baseball, and all this stuff. And I knew he would disagree with some of those because I knew about his philosophy of greatness, his standard of greatness. And there was one that was just a terrible book. It just had, I don't know who they had number one, but it was just current players, and they didn't even delve into the past at all. So I showed him this, and he was as disgusted as I was with it. And finally he broke down and said, yeah, I'll do it. But he said, I'm not going to make a career out of this. He said, you're going to do the work. And that was fine with me. So I interviewed him for months and months and months. And we just made this incredible list of great players. And he got so into it that I get a call on a Sunday morning and no hello. He'd say, now where do we have Mantle on this list? And I'd say, well, he's number 7 or whatever he was. He said, well, Christ, he said, that's too low. We got to move him up higher than that. I said, well, who are you going to bump down? Because you have Mays and Aaron and these guys. And so I have to kind of talk him back around because he loved them all, loved all these hitters. He just admired them, And of course, the inevitable discussion was, what about you, Ted? Where are we going to put you? I don't want to be mentioned at all in those terms. Let others make that determination. So he didn't rank himself in this book of the great hitters of all time.
Interesting.
So he had Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Jimmy Fox and all these guys, but he didn't have himself, which was obviously ridiculous. So in the later editions, we had a third party write Ted Williams' story. Yeah.
Very interesting. A lot of these superstars, whether it's Wayne Gretzky or Gordie Howe or Ted Williams, there's just an incredible modesty.
Oh, that's the part that struck me. He was full of bravado and so on. He was not modest about what he could do, but he was not promoting himself at all. But if someone asked him a question, he answered it honestly. Probably the most honest guy I ever interviewed. And to the point where I remember asking him about Pete Rose. I kept bringing up Pete Rose. We're going to have Pete Rose in the book. And this is before the betting. It wasn't anything to do with that. He said, no, I don't want Pete Rose in the book. And I said, why not, Ted? He said, basically because he didn't fit his definition of a great hitter. To Ted, you had to have the average and the power. Yeah. Well, obviously Rose had the average and he had the hustle and all those things. But he didn't qualify with Ted as a great hitter. He said, if I was starting a franchise, I'd want Pete Rose there, right? No question. Yeah. But so I said, finally I kept at him about that a little bit. And he said, I believe what my friend Mickey Mantle said about Pete Rose. And I said, what was that? He said, Mickey said, if I hit like Pete Rose, I'd wear a dress. And I said, Ted, you don't want me to say that. And then he went, I don't give a, So I was in the book, and so he spoke his own mind. And I asked him to compare himself with Yastrzemski, and he went on this long thing about Yastrzemski being, he said Yastrzemski was a better all-around player than he was, but in terms of hitting, he explained why he was better. And it made perfect sense. I mean, there's no question. They're not even close. So there's that honesty, as you know, Len, when you're interviewing people, it's very rare to get that level of honesty from somebody, and sometimes to his own detriment, probably, but it's great to see, refreshing.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And, in this day and age of sports athletes and coaches, it's why I appreciated people like Don Cherry and stuff. Like him or not, he spoke his mind.
Oh, yeah.
Whether you agreed with him or not. And I think now our pro athletes are so well rehearsed in what they're going to say. And it is refreshing to hear somebody be very honest.
Yeah, no question. They seem to speak through their agents now. And that's discouraging, In the day, you mentioned Don Cherry. I interviewed him and his partner. That was a very interesting interview. And I came away I was never a huge fan of his, to be honest, but I was very impressed with him, just his professionalism, and he apologized because he missed the call at one point or something. He's just a good guy. The interview was about Paul Henderson, so he had some nice things to say about Paul. And the other person I remember as being very honest, and another case of somebody I didn't necessarily think very highly of before talking to him, was Bobby Clark. Bobby Clark, I always hated the fact that he slashed Harlem off back in the '72 Summit Series. I just thought that was a dirty move. So I interviewed him and I asked him all these questions. I was a safe distance on the telephone, so I was a safe distance. But he was completely honest. He said, he used the term, I hunted him down and slashed him. I said, were you trying to injure him? He said, I didn't think about that. I was just trying to slow him down, which I think all was true. I still think he did it wasn't the most sportsmanlike thing to do, but you got to give him credit for honesty. He didn't hide from it at all or make excuses. And he's loyal to a fault. He was defending Len and Eagleson, and that was something not too many people do, but he figured that Eagleson was the guy who got them there into the Summit Series, and he was going to stick by him. So,
Eric, you jump in there.
Well, I know that you've spoken a lot about Ted Williams. I'm kind of curious to know. I'm gonna say Ted Williams is probably in the top of your.
Oh yeah.
Who would be second? Who would be someone that really stood out as great interview if you did, or a person that you just have a lot of admiration for in baseball? In
baseball? Oh, okay. Well, Stan Musial. I talked to Stan Musial. He was wonderful. I talked to a lot of ball players actually, and Brooks Robinson and George Steinbrenner. I had a great interview with George Steinbrenner, which was nice. Another one I didn't expect to like. I came away really liking the guy, and he was a huge Ted Williams fan. I mean, he told me that Ted Williams was the best left-hand hitter he ever saw, and I said, Babe Ruth was a left-hand hitter. And he said, I know. He thought he was the best. He said, in my mind, Ted Williams was the greatest left-hand hitter I ever saw. Joe DiMaggio was the greatest right-hand hitter. But I know that he thought Ted was the greatest hitter of all time, because he grew up in Cleveland, and he said one time he was walking home from a game from Cleveland Stadium, and Ted Williams was ahead of him walking. So he fell into step with him, and they talked all the way back to the hotel, apparently. And he was a huge, huge Ted Williams fan. So I found that interesting. That would be one, Eric. The other, John Beliveau and Paul Henderson in hockey, to me, are two of the true gentlemen of sports. Both of them. John Beliveau is just almost too good to be true. I mean, I talked to guys like Ronnie Ellis and Darryl Sittler and Paul Henderson, and they were all Leafs at one point or another, and they all held him up as the guy they would like to be like. He's just a class act from the word go. In baseball, there are many. I was a huge Tony Conigliaro fan. I don't know if you remember Tony C., but he played in the 60s and 70s. He got hit in the face by a pitch, and he died a number of years later, probably as a result of that. He was a great ball player. Nomar Garcia-Pero was another one I really liked. Fred Lynn, who I recently interviewed for a book I did on the talk about ill-timed books. I did a book on the Red Sox outfield of Betts, Benintendi, and Jackie Bradley Jr. And now, of course, Betts is no longer a Red Sox player, so that was not good. But those guys stand out. Musial is just a class guy, Yeah. Like you said, Len, the ones that are the biggest seem to be the nicest, and they don't have anything to prove, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes media can make people into something that they are not either.
Absolutely.
I've heard that about a lot of different athletes, that you get this image of, like, I'm not a Boston fan, nor am I a Marchand fan, but if you hear people talk about him, they say he's an incredibly giving person in the community, and I've bashed him a lot on Facebook, but it's probably because he's wearing the wrong uniform. That's the big issue right there.
That's what it is, isn't it? It's right. Like us, Len, and you, Eric, with Montreal Canadiens back when John Ferguson was playing. I don't know if you remember that, but he was the most hated man in the NHL. I thought he was great, but probably if he'd been playing for the Leafs, I would have hated his guts too.
Yeah, well, there's a few guys that have worn the red, white, and blue over the years. You think of Lemieux in the 80s. He was not the most liked person. I dare say he's not, in my mind, he's not a dirty guy, but Brendan Gallagher's probably not very popular in a lot of rings.
No, again, I think he's great, but you're right.
And part of your obsession with baseball is also I've seen many pictures of your home, the room you're in right now.
Yeah.
When did that all start? When did you start collecting a lot of the memorabilia that you have?
Even when I was a kid, I had my bedroom was, had all kinds. It wasn't quite as well organized as this, but I had pictures all of Red Sox players and all over the place, and scrapbooks of articles. I'd cut articles out of the Sporting News or the Halifax paper or whatever, and keep all those things. It was really reached ahead around 64, 65. I was really heavily into that. That's when I really developed my love for the Red Sox, I think. And so when I, later on, I still had some of the things left over from them, including some of the baseballs that I mentioned that I got from Yawkey.
Right.
And I decided I was going to start collecting a few things, and yard sales. I put an ad in the paper one time, anybody with old issues of sport magazines.
Right.
And I got a response from a guy in Halifax, and he just had a ton of this stuff. And he loved to talk and everything, so I'd go in there and he'd tell me the story of each one and where he got it and all this kind of stuff. So I got all those, and I wrote away for others, and people gave me others. And I probably got 50 things autographed by Ted Williams in this room. Bats, balls, magazines, and all that kind of stuff.
So here's the $1 million question. Who would have more stuff saved in their home, Jim Prime or Burton Russell?
Well, Burton is so secretive. I can't find out what he's got in there, but I suspect Burton has a ton of stuff. I know he has a lot of cards, and there's nobody on earth who knows more about Nova Scotia baseball than Burton Russell, or is more passionate about it than Burton Russell. So I'd have to see his collection first before I could comment.
Well, you guys share a great passion, and that's for sports, and obviously yours, especially for the Boston Red Sox. And I could sit here all afternoon. This could be a 4-hour podcast, but but I think Eric's got his quick fire questions to put you on the hot stove.
Yeah, I'm going to throw them out at you real quickly here.
And now it's time for Eric's Cut to the Chase 5 questions.
What are 3 words that best describe you, Jim Prime?
Well, persistent. I will say I'm persistent. I'd like to think I'm kind.
Okay.
I'd like to think I have a sense of humor. Those 3 are fine with me on my team.
Okay. I figured persistent was going to be one of them. What's the most embarrassed you've ever been?
Oh boy, I knew you were going to ask that, so I have 3. There's so many. This could take a 4-hour podcast. My phone is ringing.
I'm going through the same thing. Somebody's outside pulling a clothesline.
Oh yeah. 3 things. One was I went to New Brunswick, drove to St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and interviewed Don Sweeney at his home for the Hockey Digest. I went in, had a nice interview with Don Sweeney, nice guy and all that. And I'm going to let that ring until it stops, if that's okay. And came out to the car. My wife had waited in the car, gone to do some shopping or something. And when I came out, I put the tape in the tape player, and there wasn't a friggin' thing on the darn thing.
Oh.
And I was too embarrassed to go back. So this interview that had been okayed by the Hockey Digest about this guy who was a Harvard graduate and a defenseman for the Bruins, which is pretty rare. Never saw the light of day, unfortunately.
Oh, my.
That was an embarrassment, and I felt very disappointed. I tried to recreate it because there were a few staticky, little scratchy sounds, but I couldn't remember it. It was a disaster. The other was the 2 others. One, when Paul Henderson scored his winning goal in the Summit Series, I was driving a educator from the U.S. to the airport in Halifax. And when he scored the goal, I immediately got a nosebleed and almost went off the road into the ditch. So he was from Minnesota, and he figured it must be a Canadian thing. I think he
Exactly.
He didn't make fun of me, but that was big stuff. And then the last one, and possibly the biggest, was when I was asked to throw out the first pitch at Fenway Park in 2000 and I forget the year, a few years ago. On July 5th, they were playing the Blue Jays, and it was Nova Scotia Day at Fenway, which we had helped organize, our Red Sox group. And I threw out the first pitch, and I wasn't a great ball player, but I used to be a pretty good ball player, and defensively especially, I was pretty good. And my arm was kind of lively, it wasn't too bad. So I figured it's a piece of cake to do this, but I didn't allow for the mound. They said, do you want to throw from the mound or from in front of the mound? And of course I had to be the big shot and throw from the mound, and the ball just took off. And it was, I think it hit a nun in the third row or something.
Oh, well, at least it made it past the plate.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Seen some balls fall short. It's like,
yeah. No, it had plenty of height on it.
Very big strike zone.
Right. My last question is going to be, what would you consider your biggest accomplishment in life so far? Because life is still rolling along.
This is going to sound corny, but I have to say my kids, I'm so proud of my kids. I have a daughter in California, married to a Kentville lad, and I'm just so proud of her and her kids, my grandsons, one of who plays Little League Baseball out there, and my son in Kentville, who's they're just turned out to be wonderful, wonderful human beings. And they married extremely well, both of them, in terms of the character of the people that they married. So that would be number one. Of course, the Ted Williams thing, in terms of what I've written, just getting to know Ted and sit down with your hero and talk about Babe Ruth or Hank Greenberg or all these guys, many of whom he had played with or against. Hank Aaron. I interviewed Hank Aaron a few times as well. And to hear that mutual admiration between those two guys, it's spine tingling sometimes, to hear that kind of stuff. So that would be it. But yeah, there's no question my kids would be number one in terms.
That's a good answer. Good answer.
Well, you've had a lot of great answers for us this afternoon and doing this. And Jim, we look forward to, I hope there's more books in the offing.
Actually, I'm working on a book that has nothing to do with sports at the moment. And it's actually about the flower cart, which is
nice, yeah.
the 50th anniversary of the flower cart.
50 years.
Yes, that's
wow.
50 years. And so I was asked to do that, and I have to say it's been very, very interesting. They started in 1970 with, I think, 3 people, and it's a major deal going on. They're building a new facility and so on. So it's wonderful, and it's very inspirational, I have to say.
Well, it's going to be fun to see that book come out and all the other books that you've done. Jim, thanks for doing this, and continued success. It's been a great career, and it's not over yet.
Well, thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing this.